Morning, everybody. We're still working around a little bit, but does everybody have a copy of today's handout? Okay, now I was asked last week for a copy of a previous week's handout, and I did not have them. I brought 3 or 4 of every week with me today, so if you were wanting one or need one, trying to complete a set or something, I've got spares up here, so come and see me after class. And the notice on the board today is nothing to do with class, but my younger son once accused me of being a hoarder, because if I use anything, if the piece of wood's longer than about like that, I keep it. Or I used to have a collection of plumber's tape, because every time I had to do something with plumbing, I'd buy another roll of tape, forgetting that I already had 6 on the shelf in the garage someplace, and so finally I realized it's better to check the shelf first instead of buying stuff. But anyway, all right, this morning we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 7. Now, want to spend a moment, though, talking to you about the idea of context. Context. Now, you've all heard that word. Usually, when a politician has said something dumb or something is going to get them in trouble later, they get confronted with their words, and what do they say? Well, I was taken out of context. Of course, oftentimes the context is actually worse than what you thought they said in the first place. But context is actually an important principle for Bible studies, because oftentimes, if you will look at the context of a verse or a passage, it can help you understand the passage better, and sometimes it can even change your understanding by looking at the context. And of course, context can be a few verses before or after the verse you're looking at. It can be a whole chapter. It can be a book. Sometimes when you're studying a historical book like we are, the context is actually a whole bunch of books. If you want to understand everything that's going on here in 1 Samuel chapter 7, you kind of need to start back in Joshua and watch everything that flows up to it, and then follow it all the way down through the rest of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles to see what flows from it. This is a pretty important passage here this morning. And the context, the full context of it is pretty broad. Now, context can also be more than just the text. There's also a concept called cultural context. You remember when we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 1, I spent a lot of time talking about how important children were for Hebrew society? Well, that's cultural context. Once you understand that, do you now understand how desperate Hannah was since she was barren, with the importance of children in Hebrew society? And sometimes there's also historical context. The Bible, the events in the Bible didn't happen in a vacuum. There's a whole big world outside the Bible with all kinds of things going on. And sometimes those things outside Bible history actually have an impact on Bible history. Now, God couldn't possibly tell us everything that happened in the history of the world. Who knows how big the Bible would be at that point. Plus, God had a very particular purpose in giving us the Bible. He was trying to teach us how He was working in the life of mankind to bring about a Savior, one man, Jesus, who would die and bring us all salvation. That's the whole point of the Bible. Tell us that story of God working in history to bring that about. So He's not going to spend a lot of time talking about a whole bunch of stuff outside, but sometimes that stuff outside, if we know what's going on a little bit, it'll help us understand a little more of what's going on inside the Bible. So this morning I want to spend some time looking with you at the context of 1 Samuel chapter 7. Nothing cultural, just historical context this time. The history of the Middle East, and when I say the Middle, well, I probably should be more specific than just the Middle East. The history of the land that we call Israel. And if you look real careful, Israel is roughly right there. So the history of the land of Israel is being squeezed between the powers to the south and the powers to the north and northeast. There's always a big dog marching into the land of Israel to conquer it. That pretty much just summed up the entire history of that place. Now, to the south, of course, the big dog is Egypt. Egypt can't expand to the west because you run into desert. If Egypt expands to the south, you run into really rough terrain, and you got some fierce warlike tribes that are more trouble than they're worth. So where does Egypt go? Up and out, which brings them right into the land we call Israel. Now, on the other side, the original power was the Hittites up there to the north, but as history went on, you have the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and finally the Medes and Persians. You probably recognize all of those names, don't you, from Old Testament history. So they'd come, and If you look here, everything that's pink, that's sand. Well, yeah, Daryl says in oil. Maybe that's more important now than it was then. But that's the reason why all of these folks would they would come up and around following along the rivers, and as they got down, then they would leave them pointed right at the land we call Israel. Now here's something interesting that happened. Round about the time of Moses, going all the way through the days of David and Solomon, that's a good long stretch, isn't it? 400 or 500 years. You kind of had the land we call Israel kind of experienced what I would call a holiday from history. What happened is the Egyptians got preoccupied with things at home and things on their other borders. All of these powers over here, over this way, they got preoccupied fussing around with each other, things going on at home and so on and so on, and nobody is paying attention to the land of Canaan. So what happens? Well, you get all kinds of smaller kingdoms rise up. Did you ever notice, for example, in the book of Judges, you don't have Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, do you? Or Egyptians? Did David and Solomon ever fight the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, or Egyptians? No, they didn't. All of their wars were with the smaller kingdoms around the kingdom of Israel. Now, this shows the inheritance of the 12 tribes. But I want you to notice the kingdoms around them. You have the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Arameans, sometimes called Syrians. And then you would also have down along this way, you'd have the Amalekites. And then off down here in the desert would be the Midianites, but they would come sweeping up this way. And, every now and then, the Midianites were like locusts. They would just appear ever so many years and sweep through and destroy it, take everything, and then leave. And they did just about as much devastation as the locusts would do. So, anyway, you've got the Israelites for a while not having to worry about any of the big dogs, the big empires. All their trouble came from the smaller communities or smaller kingdoms that surrounded them, okay? And one of them in particular that was a perennial thorn in the flesh was right here, the Philistines. It's curious to me that land troubled Israel almost all through the entire Old Testament. And it still troubles Israel today. Folks, that is the Gaza Strip that you're reading about in the news. That area I just circled for the Philistine kingdom, that's the Gaza Strip. In fact, there are some Arabs who will refer to the Palestinians as Philistines, and it's not a compliment. For what it's worth, the Hebrew word for Philistine is Pelishti, or plural Pelishtim. The name Palestine comes from that Hebrew word, Pelishti. Can you almost hear Palestine coming out of that? So the name Palestine goes back to the old Hebrew word for the Philistines. The Romans gave the land the name Palestine after they ran the Jews out, and they were trying to remove all traces of the Jews, so they had to give it a new name. You couldn't call it Judah anymore, like it had been for several hundred years, so they called it Philistia, Palestine. Anyway, the Philistines first show up back in Abraham's day. They were around even then. In the book of Exodus, when God first led the Israelites out of captivity, I'm sorry, I meant to erase the scribbling, not the whole picture. Let me go back one, see if it's still, okay. When God brought the Israelites out of captivity, they're over here in Egypt, okay? And he's going to bring them here to the Promised Land. Now, the short route would be to go like this. Oops, sorry, I don't know what I've done. Okay, the short route would be to go kind of up here like this, right? But instead, he took them down into the desert. You know why? Exodus 13, verse 17 says he didn't want to take them through the land of the Philistines because they were not yet a people. They were not yet a force. They were a rabble, to use the word used in the Old Testament. They were a rabble of ex-slaves who had no concept of unity and trusting God and so on. It took them 40 years to figure that out, didn't it? So he's not going to lead them straight through Philistine territory because they had to fight for every inch and they weren't ready for it. So that tells you something about how warlike the Philistines were. In the book of Joshua, the Philistines were never conquered. Toward the end of his life, Joshua gives a rundown on progress so far, and he mentions all the places that have yet to be conquered, and the Philistines are one of them. That's in chapter 13 of Joshua. Shamgar, the judge, fought the Philistines. Samson, the judge, fought the Philistines. Samuel, the judge, fought the Philistines. The first king, Saul, fought the Philistines, actually was killed by them. David finally pretty much did them in. Samuel struck a huge blow here in chapter 7, but it's only after the time of David that they're mostly quieted down. However, throughout the period of the divided monarchy, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, after the time of Solomon, throughout that bit, you had occasional skirmishes with the Philistines. They never truly go away in the entire Old Testament. When you get to the New Testament, they pretty much vanished. Their descendants would be the people living in the land, some of the Gentiles living in the land during the time of Jesus. Now, let's go to some more local, some more historical context, more immediate here. What's happened just before chapter 7 is, mentioned this last week, Eli's sons led the Israelites in battle against the Philistines. And they had the bright idea of carrying the Ark of the Covenant into battle with them. Because, of course, if they carried that along, they would just conquer anybody, right? That's what they thought. So taking it like a good luck charm, they go into battle, and what happens? They get beat, majorly. Lots of Israelites die, including Eli's sons. The Ark of the Covenant is captured, and when word of all of that loss gets brought back to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, Eli, the old man, he's so stunned, he falls off his stool and breaks his neck and dies. And then, from all we can tell, it appears that the sanctuary at Shiloh was itself destroyed, because you never hear of the tabernacle ever again. The tent of meeting, you never hear of it ever again. And Samuel, at the end of chapter 7, has to build a new altar to officiate at. Apparently the one at Shiloh that they'd been using has been destroyed. So all of that kind of starts to set us up for chapter 7. Now, one last bit of context, biblical context. I want you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is basically Moses' final sermon. And in it, he is reiterating most of the law that's been given in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. In fact, the name Deuteronomy, it's Greek, deuteros, second, onoma, law. The second law, it's the second giving of the law. And as he's going through this, it kind of gets down to the end. He tells them, starting in verse 1 of chapter 28, if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds and the flock and the young of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in. Blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before you. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Okay? Basically, anything good you could ever want, God will give you if you obey the word of the Lord. Now, after he finishes the blessings, he goes into the curses, which basically you take everything he's just said and reverse it, and that's the curse. Your crops won't yield. Your wife will have trouble having children. Your flocks or herds will not increase. You'll lose to your enemies. Everything bad you could conceive of is going to happen if you don't keep the word of the Lord. Now, I say that's the context for 1 Samuel chapter 7 because how have things been going for Israel prior to chapter 7? Not very good. Why? Because they've not been keeping the word of the Lord. And all the bad things that he promised them have come about, including losing to their enemies in battle, to the point where the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. By the way, there is a hilarious story about what happened with the Ark in Philistines' territory and how they sent it back. We don't have time to go into all that today, but it's just To me, I think it's hilarious. You ought to read chapters 5 and 6 and keep this in mind. They're probably talking about bubonic plague or something very much like that. So anyway, that little treat for you later, but look at chapters 5 and 6. So you have all these blessings and curses, and then after that, you get to the book of Joshua. Joshua was told by Moses that once you enter the promised land, you're to take the people and you're to set half of them on Mount Ebal and half of them on Mount Gerizim. Now that's a picture looking at those two mountains from the south. And you can see they're not very far apart, are they? So what Joshua did in chapter 8, after they conquered Jericho and after they finally conquered Ai, he took 6 of the tribes and had them all stand on Mount Gerizim, and he had 6 of the tribes standing on Mount Ebal. And the tribes on Mount Gerizim chanted all the blessings that Moses had described. Those on Ebal chanted all the curses. Now, can you imagine how impressive that must have been to the Israelites? That was kind of the point of it. God, through Moses, told Joshua to stage this ceremony in an effort to do something so unforgettable that hopefully the Israelites would not then forget the law. Fortunately, it didn't last longer than about a generation, but that's part of the context going on here. The Israelites were to be committed and faithful to God's word if they expected to be blessed by God. Now, go to chapter 7. Whoops. Don't want him yet. Go to chapter 7, verse 3. Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord, you're going to come back now and keep his law. If you're doing that with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So the people of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah and drew water, poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day, and said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. This is what I would call a covenant renewal ceremony. They have forgotten their covenant with God. They've forgotten God's word, but now they want to get right with God. So Samuel says, okay, first thing, you got to get rid of all the false gods. Because you're fixing to call on God and hold him to account for his promises, right? You're expecting him to bless you. You can't do that while you're also worshiping a foreign god. And they mention specifically the Baals and the Ashtaroth. This is an image of one of multiple images of Baal that's been found. He's often shown, the thing he's holding in his hand here, that's more than likely a thunderbolt, because he is the rider on the storms, one of his titles. Now, Baal simply means Lord. The word Baal means Lord. So there was usually another word attached to it, like Baal Hermon, the Lord of Hermon, the city of Hermon, or Baal this and Baal that. There were literally hundreds of Baals scattered throughout the land of Israel. We don't know for sure if they thought of it as one God with a bunch of different manifestations or a whole bunch of different gods. Doesn't really matter. It's not the Lord God, is it? So whatever they thought of him, if they worshiped him, they were wrong. Now, Ashtaroth was the goddess of fertility, love, and war. I find that kind of curious, that you'd have fertility and love mixed with war. I'm not entirely sure how that all goes together, but that's what she was. Usually her images are much more sexual in nature, a gross exaggeration of female characteristics, because they put a real emphasis on the fertility part. She was also known as Ashtoreth, sometimes as Astarte, and sometimes she was mixed up with another goddess named Asherah. You've heard that one before? Asherah was Baal's consort, glorified girlfriend. And Ashtaroth wasn't necessarily Baal's consort, but sometimes she kind of acted like he was. You know, Canaanite mythology, this all goes back to the ancient Canaanites, all these gods here. It wasn't real clear cut. And you probably remember studying Greek mythology back when you were in high school. Anybody have to do that besides me? Even then sometimes it was kind of confusing, right? Zeus isn't the same from one story to the next, and different gods are given credit for the same. It just gets confusing. But that's the nature of mythology. There's no official text like there is the Bible to keep everything, that kept everything organized and clear. So the bottom line is there was a god and a goddess that the Israelites had fallen into worshiping. And Samuel tells them, if you're going to count on God to do things for you, you're going to have to put that stuff away. You can't hold him to his promises while you're worshiping another god. And then you notice also that they fasted and confessed their sins. I don't know if you ever spent time fasting. I'm not going to tell you I've done it a lot. I have done it a little bit. But it really does clear your mind. It's one of the effects of it. It seems to help you focus on whatever is important to you at that moment. Well, they're trying to renew their covenant with God. They don't know the battle's coming. The Philistines haven't entered the picture yet. They're simply trying to restore their focus on God. And part of doing that is fasting and confessing their sins. Now, the Philistines heard that all of Israel had assembled at Mizpah. And there seem to be two things going on here. Because see, they hear about the assembly at Mizpah, and they decide, this is a good time to strike. Either they just thought it was a good, convenient time to strike because all the Israelites were gathered, or it may also be that in the process of capturing the ark and then having to return the ark, the Philistines may have been afraid that if the Israelites have their ark back, that they might be feeling a little bit rowdy and might be getting up to something. Maybe this meeting in Mizpah was gathering the troops to attack the Philistines. So let's attack them first. Whatever they're thinking, they decide to attack the Israelites at Mizpah. Now, the Israelites were not prepared for war. That's not why they gathered. And even if they had prepared for war, they would have been outgunned because the Philistines had iron weapons and the Israelites did not. You read several chapters on, I believe it's chapter 19, you read about the Philistines having a monopoly on iron, and if an Israelite had an iron hoe or an iron plow or iron anything they needed sharpened, they had to go to a Philistine town to have a blacksmith do that for them. And only Saul and his son Jonathan had iron swords. The rest of the Israelites, if they had swords or weapons at all, they would have been made out of bronze. Think about that for a minute. Bronze can cut, but it's soft compared to iron. If your weapons are bronze and the other guys are iron, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. It's kind of like the beginning of World War II when the French army tried to take cavalry, men on horses, to face the Nazi tanks. That didn't go too well. Well, iron and bronze doesn't go too well for whoever's got bronze. So even if the Israelites had weapons, they would have been outgunned. But they weren't gathering to fight a battle. They were gathering to renew their covenant to God. So if you look down here at verse 7, the Israelites heard that the Philistines were marching. They were scared to death. They weren't prepared. They knew they were outgunned. This was not a good scene. So Samuel says, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So he offers a whole burnt offering to the God, and he cries out in prayer to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Look at the end of verse 10. The Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines, and threw them into confusion, and they were defeated before Israel. Now, do you remember what the blessing said back in chapter 28? Your enemy's going to march at you from one direction and go running off in 7 directions. What does that mean, running away in 7 directions? They're going to be scattered. They're fleeing for their lives. And that's what happened here. This is a graphic fulfillment of that blessing in Deuteronomy chapter 28. God thunders, and I've been caught out in a thunderstorm before. I can remember had the tractor. I was up on the far part of the farm counting the cows and making sure everybody was okay. And the storm blew up all of a sudden, and I had to go about 1.5 miles on a tractor that did about 5 miles an hour at tops, with all this thunder and lightning crashing here, and I was scared to death. Because I'm on this metal beast. I'm not exactly the best place to be, going down the middle of a road where there's no cover, right? Open dirt road, and I'm on this metal tractor, and all this thunder and lightning here, and I was scared. I don't know if it was something like that, or maybe God's thunder was lower to the ground. Who knows? For whatever reason, it threw the Philistines into some sort of fit, and they all just took off and ran. So the Israelites, unprepared as they were, jumped up with whatever they had and tore after them and achieved a great victory that day, killing many Philistines. Now here's the really interesting part. Well, not quite there yet, excuse me. All right, so the Lord achieves this great battle, or great victory for the Israelites, and Samuel takes a stone, probably about as tall as a man, and turns it upright and calls it the Even Ha'etzer, the stone of help. Now, what's interesting is, look back at chapter 4 and verse 1. Remember I told you there was a battle where they carried the Ark of the Covenant into battle with them, and it was a huge defeat for the Israelites? Guess where that battle took place? A little spot called Even Ha'etzer. So that was the site of the great loss where the Ark was captured, the priests died, and all of that went on. But now they've had a victory, and so Samuel is going to redeem that name, reclaim that name for Israel. And he sets up this stone of help because he says, hitherto, to this point, the Lord has helped us. It was a memorial for the great victory that the Lord gave Israel on that day. And you know, we've got a song that sings about that. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come. That's almost quoting Samuel. The Lord has helped us to this point. So he sets it up, and then we're told, look at verse 14. The cities the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored from Ekron to Gath, and Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. And also look at verse 13. The Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Okay, so the Philistines were subdued and never again entered the territory of Israel. Now, like I've already mentioned, there were battles between Israel and the Philistines all through the life of Samuel, all through the life of the kingship of Saul and David, and even on into the divided monarchy. There were skirmishes. It didn't mean that the Philistines went away for good. But what it meant was they never again conquered the land of Israel and controlled the people of Israel. They had done that multiple times prior, but from after chapter 7 of 1 Samuel, never happens again. Now, did the Israelites lose battles here and there? Sure. Saul lost several against them. But they never were conquered as a people and had their land occupied. And he goes into some length here, mentioning the restoration of territory. Why was that such a big deal? Why was it so important that Israel get its land back from the Philistines? Promised by. We call it the promised land, right? It was promised by God. God led the distribution of the land among the tribes. This was, folks, as far as the Israelites were concerned, this was sacred territory. This had been given to them by God himself, and to lose it to these pagan Philistines was a horrible shame. So getting it restored was basically, it means the world has been made right again. You know, the people that are supposed to have the land again. And I would guess that it probably went back to the tribes and clans and families that originally had possessed it before the Philistines took it from them. And then it says there were peace between Israel and the Philistines, the Amorites. The Amorites were some of the earliest inhabitants of the land of Canaan. You read about them off and on through the whole Old Testament. Sometimes the name Amorite is used to mean Canaanites. Now, by the time of Samuel, the Amorites were no longer an organized people. They didn't have a kingdom of their own anywhere, but there were still pockets of them scattered throughout the land. And it appears that any time a foreign power, like the Philistines, anytime a foreign power came and troubled Israel, the Amorites would use that as an opportunity to cause mischief. They would attack a town, plunder another town, just do all kinds of nasty things like that. But after the Israelites put down the Philistines, the Amorites decided it would be better off to behave. Because if somebody has just beaten, the Philistines were the regional power, and the Israelites have just wiped them up. Well, if the Israelites are capable of doing that, what are they capable of doing to the Amorites if they wanted to? That's the way the thinking would go. So the Israelites, the Philistines have been defeated. The Amorites are behaving themselves, and for the duration of Samuel's judgeship, in other words, up until Saul becomes king, there's peace between Israel and the Philistines and Amorites. The last thing mentioned here is that Samuel then started going on a circuit every year. Now, this right down here is the top of the Dead Sea. Let you get your bearings a little bit. So we're sort of in the northern part of the land of Israel. Samuel's home was the city of Ramah, or the town of Ramah right there. And we're told that he went on a circuit every year between Gilgal, Bethel, and Mizpah. Every year he would go to those three cities, and it appears that he actually did real judging. Okay, now remember, in the Old Testament, a judge is not somebody that heard cases. It's someone who rescued Israel from an oppressor. Well, Samuel rescued him from an oppressor, but he also heard cases. He's one of two. He and Deborah appear to have actually heard legal cases. So he would make this circuit every year, and people would come to him with their disputes. Maybe some of them came to get a word of the Lord, get guidance from him, because Samuel was also a prophet. It appears that Deborah did some of that as well, providing answers from God to questions they had, guidance they needed for their lives. But Samuel would make that circuit every year and hear cases. But he spent most of his time at Ramah, which was his home. And we're told that he built an altar there to the Lord. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it appears that Shiloh, where the tabernacle and the altar had been, it appears that was destroyed in the battle where the ark was captured. Samuel is the high priest, right? You would expect him to have a place where he would regularly do his priestly occupation that requires an altar, so it appears that he built an altar there. Now, the only thing that's a little bit odd about this is that there's no mention that God told him to build an altar at Ramah. The altar was to be built and sacrifices offered at the place that God chose. All I can tell you is, as far as we know, God hasn't chosen anything yet. He later chooses Jerusalem, and David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, right? And sets it up in a tent of some sort to start with, kind of like what the tabernacle had been. And then later on, Solomon builds the temple, and the Ark is placed there, and God's presence descends to dwell in the temple. But up to now, God has not yet expressed a preference or a location where you're supposed to build the altar. So Samuel builds the altar at his home, and he offers sacrifice and conducts his activity there. All right, that's what we got for this week. And let me double check. Next week, we're going to look at chapter 8, where the Israelites demand a king. Chapter 8, the Israelites demand a king. And we are not going to go into Samuel's warning about a king too much. I'm saving that for later. But, suffice it to say that Samuel was not real thrilled with the Israelites' call to have a king. But read about that in chapter 7. And if you want a little fun, read chapters 5 and 6 about what happened to the Philistines after they captured the ark. Thank you for your attention.